collaborative approach to education that utilizes the resources of everyone in the school community in order to foster the success of all students. And what it means to me is that it allows a pathway by which we can rethink and reimagine education, particularly for those of us who are folks with disabilities, those of us who are neurodiverse. I would really say just for any sort of marginalized people passing through the education system, I think that it allows for a different approach to education that increases the probability that it will all be successful.
The belief in the fundamental right of access to quality education for all students, that really is a strong foundation of, it was what I taught, it's what I believe in. And, what that looks like in a school is, children learning in their neighborhood schools with their friends, in age-appropriate classrooms with their peers, and, in that least restrictive environment where there's that access to high quality instruction, but students also, are receiving interventions and supports that they may individually need. There's an element of school culture that builds into that where you're not only celebrating differences, but it's normalizing it.
I think about it in two ways. I think inclusive education can be defined through the lens of maybe the learner or the student. And in this way, I would say inclusive education is really about meeting the needs of all learners in an environment with high expectations, yet flexible and regular. And I think there's a deeper meaning. So I've been reflecting a lot and reading a lot about why we really have school. And, it's these kinds of questions you go through life and you don't always stop and really think. I had to really challenge my own thoughts about why do we have schools and what is the purpose or what are we expecting them to provide families and students? And I think, so this is kind of the second layer of my definition. There's that first instructional student layer, but then I think there's a wider community definition for inclusion, which really has to do with this notion of creating citizens who are going to be part of this diverse community. And it's sort of, to me, an inclusive classroom is sort of like a training ground for that citizenship. So yes, there is the day-to-day instructional inclusive definition, which would be meeting the needs of all the learners in this kind of flexible but high expectation way. Then there's also the definition of inclusion, which really is about perpetuating citizenship among a diverse community or a diverse society. So I think it's sort of, there's a smaller and a bigger way to look at it. For me, both those are part of the definition.
When I'm talking about inclusive education, I'm not talking about taking students who have been in more restrictive settings and simply dumping them in general education classrooms. When we're talking about inclusive education, we are talking about educating all students by providing them the supports they need, modifications they need, really ensuring that the instructional environment for all students is of high quality and meets those students' needs. It is not simply a dump and run situation, and it takes work. It takes a lot of work and it takes a lot of effort, but it is so worth it in the end. And I'd also like to point out that when the Individuals with Disabilities in Education Act was passed, actually written into the law, it says 30 years of research have shown that inclusive education is essentially better for all students. And that law was passed over 40 years ago. So in the last 40 years, the research has not grown less. It has grown more pointed and more understood that inclusive education really is the best practice for all students, but most specifically for students with disabilities.
A classroom where all learners are engaged, they're being treated with respect. The staff in the building are building relationships, that sense of community. They're circulating and meeting the needs of students, even if it's individually, the individual has unique and different needs. Everybody can accommodate them and meet these needs. Collaboration is definitely key among staff members, using universal design of learning, multisensory instruction, use of accommodations and modifications, or station teaching, having peers work together. So just really a cohesive, flowing, well-oiled machine is our goal. I don't know if we're there yet everywhere, but I think that is the long-term goal, is to walk into a classroom and see it just all working cohesively.
When I think about inclusion, first and foremost, I see it as a civil right for students to be able to get the education that they deserve in an environment that suits them with, their grade level peers. I think one of the major misconceptions about inclusion is that it's thought of as a place or a location, meaning that if you were to put students who have varying needs in another classroom, now you've accomplished inclusion, or you're doing inclusion. And I think that one of the things that I often talk about with my students is that it's a mindset. Inclusion is something that we need to believe in first. We need to believe that all of these students belong here and all of these students are capable. And I think that is one of the essential, prerequisites of inclusion. We have to think not as inclusion as doing something. In other words, it's not something that we are, checking off the box by physically placing the students inside, or, giving them certain work to do. But really it's creating a community. So I see inclusion and inclusive education as our ability to kind of create a community where learner diversity is apparent and is being attended to. And it goes beyond, attending to learner diversity in terms of academic needs, but also we are creating a community of learners where there's social belonging, so that students, are feeling that they belong in that classroom. It's not just about, providing accommodations and modifications, but it's really making opportunities for students to feel part of this inclusive community. I always dream of the world where we no longer have to say inclusive education, because all education, really in my mind should be inclusive. In other words, there's learner variability, not just students with IEPs, but all students have learner diversity and variability. So it's just doing our job by meeting their needs, both academically and socially.
When I think of inclusion, I just think of the real world. And there is no place in the world or in my community that my daughter with a disability is excluded. We sit at the same tables at restaurants, we sit in the same pew in church, and the only place that I found that was segregated seemed to be our schools, and just logically that didn't make sense to me. So for me, I view inclusion, which I think every parent of a typical child takes for granted. I view inclusion as my daughter being able to go to school and experience the same things, be in the same classrooms as my older children did, who are neurotypical. So I had a very simplistic view of what inclusion was to begin with. But as she got into school, it became more distinct, where you start looking at inclusion in a classroom. Inclusion is not putting a child with a disability in a classroom and then pulling them to a back table and working with them on their own. So they're much more, as you get into the academics of it, inclusion means so much, but on a broad scale. For me, inclusion was having my daughter have the opportunity to go to school with her neighbors and community members, getting in a carpool, simple things that parents of neurotypical kids take for granted.
Inclusive education means that we not only teach special ed students how to communicate with other people, but we teach their regular ed peers how to communicate with them. Inclusive education means allowing people with disabilities to be part of the regular ed population. And one of my analogies I made a flag about inclusion, in which the yellow stripe means people without disabilities, blue meaning people with disabilities, and the center stripe is green, which means we're integrating both groups of people to be together.
Even though some people are different, we can all be friends on the bottom, but the flag wouldn't typically have the words on it, but he came up with that idea. So I think inclusive education just really basically means giving people the same opportunity to sit up as everybody else in the same environment.
As a disability studies researcher, for me, inclusive education is about equity and rights, right? Inclusive education is an avenue for equity in schools and therefore ultimately equity in society. My views about inclusive education align with the perspectives of the disability rights movement. Separate education, segregated education it's a form of segregation, right? And it's ultimately rooted in the oppression of people with disabilities. So from that role, that's how I approach inclusive education. Right. From my role as a teacher educator, I need to think about more practical ways of approaching it, right? It's about access. How do we prepare teachers to recognize the barriers to learning for all children? All kinds of barriers, whether they're physical barriers, sensory barriers, learning barriers, or attitudinal barriers. How can they develop strategies in their classrooms to creating a meaningful education that is responsive to each child's unique needs and strengths? Of course, like any mother, I want my children to be accepted, and not just accepted, but valued members of their communities, right? But the question for me is, how can we get to that place, right? How can we talk about inclusive communities where we still live in a society where we have segregated schools, where we're separating children, where we're sorting children based on their abilities and disabilities? I mean, schools should mirror society, or at least they should mirror the society that we want to have.